So without further ado, we'll get started. So if you're unfamiliar with Medical Herstory, we are an international award-winning youth-led not-for-profit, and we're on a mission to eliminate sexism, shame, and stigma from health experiences. We do this through our three main portfolios of medical education, patient advocacy, and today, Undoing Stigma. We host a range of events like this one. We also do workshops for medical students, patients, providers, as well as the public. And we have an online publication where you can share your stories relating to health experiences. We also do a lot of social media campaigns on a range of different issues. And you can follow us at Medical Herstory on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. And today we have a giveaway going on. So if you haven't entered yet, fear not. The first two steps were signing up for the event and attending. So if you are here, you have done those successfully. The last one is to head over to our Instagram at Medical Herstory. There's a link in the chat now if you don't follow us, where you can just go and comment on that post to be entered for your chance to win. And we have some awesome prizes from Ash and Chess, who are a trans-owned company. We have an awesome tote bag, a poster, and some pronoun pins. So definitely head over and enter. We'll be announcing the winner of that at the end of today's event. And now I'm going to pass it over to Yuki, who's our amazing events director for Undoing Stigma, who will be hosting the next portion.
So I'd like to give a land acknowledgement. Medical Herstory is based in Jojage. Many of our events and operations are located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Kanien'kehá:ka, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron, Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe nations. Medical Herstory recognizes and respects these groups as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which many of us are today. We cannot begin to discuss patient advocacy, barriers to access and care, or internalized stigma without recognizing the role that colonization, white supremacy, and medical racism play in the social structures which healthcare as an institution is situated in. We'd like to give a brief content warning. The following discussions can contain material of a sensitive and explicit nature, which might be upsetting to some participants. The topics covered can include, but are not limited to discussions of sexuality, trauma, and assault. Quick note, Medical Herstory, we do have active listeners on our team. You'll see in our names, it is mentioned right away. And so please feel free to reach out to any of us at any time if you need extra support. Just a few Zoom rules. Please remain muted if you're not speaking. This goes for everyone. If you're comfortable, please keep your camera on. Please don't interrupt. There are questions and comments are encouraged. Feel free to write them in the chat throughout the event. There will be a Q&A afterwards, and we'll have allocated time for that. So if you have questions, that's your time. And most importantly, please be respectful. And closed captions are enabled, so you can activate them at any time during the event. They're just at the bottom of your screen. If you require any assistance, just reach out to anyone with Medical Herstory in their name. So I'll pass it over to Isaiah, who will be introducing our speakers for today, and I'll let Isaiah take it away.
Great, thanks, Yuki. So I'm happy to say that we have an amazing panel for today, and I'll start by introducing Megan Key. So Megan Key, who uses she, her pronouns, is an award-winning transgender activist and diversity and inclusion specialist in the public sector. Over the past 10 years, she has supported several local and national LGBT+ charities as a volunteer, facilitator, fundraiser, and speaker, including Mermaids, Stonewall, All About Trans, Birmingham LGBT, and she's currently a trustee of Gendered Intelligence. Megan co-created the online community Trans Workers UK to promote inclusion of transgender people in the workplace and has contributed to public policy development on trans issues. Her personal experiences and efforts to amplify those of the diverse trans community have featured online, on radio, on TV, and in print, discussing employment, prisons, sports, and relationships. Megan is featured on the independent newspaper's Rainbow List of 100 Influential LGBT+ People and received a National Diversity Award for her work on LGBT+ issues. So we're very happy to have her. And then next, I'll be introducing Evie DeLuca. So Evie DeLuca, who uses she, her pronouns, is a South Asian trans writer and performer. She's the author of Tainted Beauty, the memoir of Unauthentic Creation. which she tells her story of being trans and growing up in a Muslim community in the UK. She's also known as the Bollywood Witch, which is her performance art persona that incorporates Bollywood culture and witchcraft to create spellbinding art. And then next, we have Joy Ellison, who uses they, them pronouns. Joy Ellison is a historian, activist, and writer. As a doctoral candidate at Ohio State University, they are researching transgender history in the Midwestern USA. They are the creator of If We Knew Trans History, a public history blog asking how our movements for justice would be different if they were informed by the legacies of transgender activism. They're also the author of Sylvia and Marcia Started Revolution, a picture book about Sylvia Rivera and Marcia Johnson. Their writing is published bi-weekly through the Rainbow Rant column at Columbus Alive. So for our last two speakers, I'll pass it back over to Yuki.
All right, awesome, thank you. We have Frankie, who uses he, they pronouns. Frankie is a sociology student at the University of Cambridge who is also committed to trans advocacy and inclusion. Having been the LGBTQ+ officer at his college and one of the university-wide trans and non-binary reps, they have focused on creating community and inclusion for trans people within university spaces. Frankie also co-runs a political magazine dedicated to empowering creatives from the north of England and has worked with charities such as Stonewall and ACT. He is honored to speak with such incredible people and to discuss a topic so close to his heart. And finally, we have Rico Chase. Rico, using he, him pronouns, Rico provided live updates at the London Black Lives Matter protests, along with revealing some of the whitewashed Black histories on his radio show Against Racism, a 9-part series exploring the various forms of racism and how we collectively can make a difference. As a board member of Trans Actual UK, he continues to strive to change UK legislation for non-binary equality, hate crime, and raises a Black queer intersectional question in all forums with speeches at the House of Commons, London Trans Pride, quoted in Forbes and Department of Transport conferences. Rico is a very vocal activist, fighting avidly for the rights of LGBTQIA+ people and Black people. And that is the end of our introduction for our lovely speakers today. I'm going to hand it off to Ella, who's a volunteer at Medical Herstory. She will be leading and facilitating our roundtable open discussion today. And so I will let Ella take it away.
Thank you so much, Yuki. I'm Ella. I use she, they pronouns, and I would just want to start by thanking our wonderful speakers so much for being a part of this conversation today. I'm so excited. And I wanted to start our conversation with a question: what does trans joy mean to you? And I think it would make the most sense to start with the most aptly named Joy Ellison. So Joy, what does trans joy mean to you? And if you feel comfortable, I would love to hear about any specific moments or experiences that come to mind.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for being here, everyone. This is such a pleasure for me. Joy is actually my given name. So I've had a lifetime to consider what the word really means. And the first thing that came to mind when I was considering this question was how when I was little, I regularly had experiences where adult men would come up to me and say, your name is Joy, why aren't you smiling? And it's classic sexism, right? I was being misunderstood as a girl child, and I was being told that I needed to perform happiness. And I think about that a lot, particularly as someone who has struggled with anxiety and depression my entire life. And I think for me that joy is that form of happiness and pleasure that can coexist with difficulty and with sadness, with anger, with struggle. And it's that part that's not commodified. Like as people who live under capitalism, we're really, and particularly as trans people, we're asked to perform a sort of happiness that you can buy, and also asked to be happy in order to be accepted in society. And I think that in these moments where we find pleasure while also rejecting that pressure, are the moments that I think of as trans joy. I think trans people are particularly good at joy because we've had to know ourselves in this really deep way, and to find happiness that is more endearing than this sort of compulsory happiness that we're often pressured to perform. And I find that often in writing. I find that in being with my my loved ones. I find that when I hear my friends call me by my name and pronouns, yeah, it's a wonderful and very deep emotion for me.
I mean, that sounds truly wonderful. And Evie, you've been nodding a lot as Joy's been speaking, and I was wondering what you relate to in what Joy's speaking about, and in what ways do you experience trans joy?
Yeah, I just related to Joy so much there. Wow, okay. Yeah, I completely agree with a lot of what Joy said. And for me, there's this misconception that, you know, that we're not happy. And I always try and say to people that, you know, we as trans people, we are actually very happy. We just don't like it when people mess with our happiness. And the moment someone messes with that, we band together and we kind of we're very vocal about that. We're not staying quiet anymore. Why should we be quiet about it? And as a result of that, society kind of latch onto the advocacy and the, you know, us kind of speaking up and go, oh, look, they're just angry. You know, they're so unhappy. Why are you always angry? And it's like, I wasn't until you opened your mouth. So it's like, I'm very much kind of one of those people where I always try and say to people that, you know, our joy is something that comes very natural to us until people kind of try and come in and tell us that we're incorrect for feeling joy. We should feel burdened. We should feel sadness. We should think that our transition is just a headache. It's like, no, it's not. It's a beautiful process that we're all going through together collectively, that we can all connect with. And that's why I called my book Tainted Beauty, because I say to people, what people perceive as tainted is actually the very thing that makes you beautiful. So don't pull away from that, you know, feel that joy and be proud of it, because it's not you that is telling you that who you are is wrong. It's everyone else. But if you take that factor out, actually, you're a very happy person. You're a beautiful person. And that's what trans joy is to me. It's something that is already built into me. I've known who I was since the day I was born. And as soon as I figured out how I could be that person, I've been an unstoppable machine. And that is what is so beautiful to me when I look back now. And that's what I try and say to everyone else with my writing, with my Bolly Witch persona, my creative art, with my day job, you know, helping trans people navigate through healthcare. I say to everyone, like, take every single moment and find that joy. Always hold on to that joy, because it's there. Just don't let anybody else tell you that you shouldn't be feeling it, because forget what they think.
That is such a powerful sentiment. And I would love to hear from Megan now and how you experience trans joy, especially as someone so prolific in the trans community and someone who's been involved in so much community work.
Thanks. Well, I'm just, you know, like I'm buoyant and I'm buzzed just by listening to Evie. Like, you've summed it up. I think I can try and add to it. I think that's a great description. I suppose, you know, I'm 46. I came out 10 years ago. I'm celebrating my 10th anniversary as a visible trans woman. And I'm really, really proud of that. And it took me 15 years to get to that position. You know, I had a nervous breakdown. I've had substance misuse challenges. I'm sober now. I don't drink, I don't take drugs, I don't smoke, but I've done all of those things. It's been a long, long road. I've had 10 years of therapy. So there's joy in itself, the fact that I'm still here and I'm thriving as a very visible spokesperson in the community, really. I love being trans. It has opened up life to me in a way that, unfortunately, I think a lot of cis het people just don't get to experience. I can't just coast through life, you know. I may have in my 20s looked like just every other white cisgender heterosexual man to the rest of the world, and I navigated life quite breezily, I guess, on the surface. But I've really had to look deep inside my personality, ask questions versions of myself, and now I live with real consciousness. So there's joy in that in itself. That's a personal joy. I mean, you can see the panelists today. We've just got a wonderful, diverse community. I'm very much part of the trans scene, if you want to use that term, not just in London where I live, but across the UK. So I've built a lot of friendships. I've met a lot of tenacious people, and I suppose a couple of the big things that have developed for me with my joy is my gender expression. When I first came out 10 years ago, it was really imperative to me to come across as femme and as cisnormative as possible, right? I wanted to pass. And now I think that's rubbish. I don't want to be like everyone else. I'm an individual. And there are times when I want to be feminine, and there are times when I'm presenting as masc. My identity doesn't change, but my expression does. And that's become very freeing. So just that aspect of being able to be who I want is a growth process, and it's still happening now, and I'm still exploring it. And then the second thing really is the fact that I've come to terms with my mental health challenges. I understand them, I understand me, they're part of me, they're not a problem, they're just an element of me, and it enables me to grow as I continue on this journey. So I still think 10 years in, I'm still transitioning, and I'm very happy about it.
I think that is so interesting, and I'd especially love to turn now to Frankie, who's one of the youngest members of our panel today. And I wonder how your experience of trans joy has been lived, especially at your age. I'm wondering if joy has always been integral to your experience as a trans person, or if it's something that's grown or developed, or something that struck you one day.
I mean, just listening to Megan and like the beautiful life that you've led and feeling like the baby here. I mean, I'm just listening to what you're saying about consciousness, and that's making me think about this kind of inherent self-awareness that so many trans people have, and the joy that you feel almost just in the kind of constant process of learning. I mean, I'm here as a speaker, and I feel like I'm just here to learn really from everyone else who's lived so much longer than me and experienced joy in so many different forms. And when looking at this question, like, I found it very hard to define trans joy as anything more than kind of like an expansive feeling. Like, it just feels like there is so much potential in transness to kind of like transform the world around us when it's so binary and cis all the time. And I was thinking, as I guess still at uni, so many of my conversations with my friends are centered around these kind of ideas. We talk about joy a lot because we're still kind of learning it. We're new to these things. Like, we haven't been around very long. When I think about myself as a trans person, you know, I haven't been kind of aware of that within myself for more than 5 years, really. And to kind of have these conversations, I remember we were chatting about when we've actually experienced trans joy, like how do you like think of that in actual terms? And I talked about when I'm just walking down the street, and like my favorite, a song comes on, like the Scissor Sisters, you know, something like that, an absolute banger. And I just like feel myself start to kind of strut down this street. Like, I can't help myself. I'm just kind of like, you know, going for it. The beats in the background, it's just a great one. And like, when as a teenager, I used to walk behind the kind of straightest, most masculine man I could see and try and copy his mannerisms, you know, like walk like as much shoulder as possible, kind of like follow his every move. And I kind of created this walk for myself. And then trans joy for me feels like listening to this song and being able to walk down a street and do the opposite of that, and walk actually with kind of quite a lot of flamboyance, which is much more natural to me, and feeling so much like happier in that. And I guess in that way, I mean, I'm very still, as I said, like new to so much of this and haven't done a lot of the advocacy stuff. And it feels like trans joy can be found so much in the small moments for me, like walking down the street, talking to my friends, making jokes in the kitchen that make cis people a little bit uncomfortable. All of these things that for me feel like, you know, the everyday that is just blossomed with joy because of my transness, like directly related to being trans. It doesn't come from I mean, I'm quite a happy person, but like it comes from transness so much and all the time, because it feels like such a, like there's so much, yeah, expansiveness in that. And just the fact that I can look forward to everyone here and see that that just kind of keeps going, that joy continues throughout life is, I don't know, I'm all right with that. I'll take that, to be honest. That's quite a nice life to lead.
I couldn't stop myself smiling just as you were speaking, Frankie. But I think you were being a bit modest when you were talking about how you haven't done enough of the advocacy work yet. But Rico undeniably has done a lot of the advocacy work, and the list goes on. So Rico, I'd love to know what trans joy means to you. In what ways do you experience it? Are there any moments that stick out for you?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you for having me. I always like panels like this because it's just like, oh, more allies. Yeah, so my backstory, I used to work in finance and trading roles, and then I ended up being bullied for being queer, not even like trans, just queer. And I ended up post-traumatic stress disorder. So it took me like 2 years to recover from that. I had to relearn how to read, write, and eat in public settings. Now, I talk about that in panels all the time, so don't feel sorry for me. But my point is, like, if you can completely lose your livelihood off the back of society, I was just like, nah. So I got into advocacy literally out of anger. Like, it was just a nice place to put it. I was like, no, you need to understand this. And then I just realized that on my journey, I met some really, really amazing people. Like, I was working on a documentary as a junior cameraman, and I met so many people, just inspirational. And I feel like my story wasn't completely unique, but people had just like come from such dark places and just becomes just almost blossomed. It's like, I like comic books, so basically I feel like every single trans person has some sort of crazy origination story. But yeah, we just keep fighting. We just literally just don't stop. But for me, trans joy is when I tell someone that trans people have always existed. We're not a new concept, that we came about, we were accepted in society. There's non-binary Egyptian pharaohs. There's non-binary people in service of the gods, the temple of Artemis. Non-binary people were like worshipped in the Gola tribes in Africa. Like, we were up there, we were doing pretty darn good for ourselves. And then colonialists came along and then, you know, just ruined it for women, people of color, and trans people. So everything went wrong at around about the same time. And I think when people understand that, like, oh, okay, so if we're fighting for women's rights, maybe we should fight for trans people as well. I'm like, yeah, you probably should. Like, the more allies that I create, the more I feel as if the world around me is going to be shaped in the way which I envision it to be safe for everyone, inclusive for everyone. And yeah, that's kind of what I do for like a living, which is quite fun. Yeah, so individualities, for me, like, I had a fair bit of dysphoria in the sense that my voice wasn't the right level. So if I get really, really happy, because I'm quite a bubbly person, my voice goes super high, and it used to really, really annoy me. So now I'm on testosterone, it kind of is the right level. But I'll just say for the group, there's people in the room who are allies, like, you don't actually have to transition to be trans. The moment in which you do say, I'm a trans person, it's the point in which you are a trans person. You even say it verbally, like, just acknowledge it to yourself. There's a significant proportion of the community that don't actually do medical intervention or even socially transition. Your identity is still valid. It's just some of us just have a certain level of dysphoria where we feel as if it's just easier to change your external presences. But yeah, I mean, yeah. And also trans joy for me is, as Frankie said, I had a little bit of toxic masculinity because I was like, oh yeah, I used to work in She Bar, which was like a lesbian bar. And they were like, you're not a lesbian because like your dad jokes are like the worst. I was like, oh, I'm not like you. I was always annoying the other bartenders. I was like, dude, and I'm like, oh my God, stop, Rico. Yeah, so, and in that space, I was like, okay, what's your pronouns? I was like, oh, you don't have to worry about that. You don't, it's okay, you don't have to accept my pronouns. And I'm like, no, if it's your identity, then you should accept it. Like moments like that where people kind of like pull you along. People always say, okay, Rico, you've done a lot. I'm like, no, I'm a product of my environment. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, like 100%. And I've learned a lot from being a director at Transaction UK, from people I work with, Helen Belcher, like Shay Brown as well, Jane Fay. Like, people have been working on the trans rights space for about 20 odd years, you know, so I've kind of had the opportunity to be in those sort of spaces, and it is really, really empowering. So yeah, also my baby face used to drive me up the wall because I still, God, I get ID'd all the time. I got ID'd buying glue for my boat once. I was just like, seriously? Glue? Then someone pointed out that trans guys, we just look like we're 12 continuously. So maybe that isn't like a worse thing. So, you know, you take things and you realize that you want to be like everyone else, but you have to always acknowledge the fact that everyone else is taken. Just be yourself, you know. No one's going to be better at being you than you. And there was this quote I saw online recently that really got me. Being a trans person is not, people say, oh, don't imagine what it's like being in a different gender. Imagine what it's like being in a different gender and everyone's telling you otherwise. That's what it feels like. Because most of the time we're quite happy and quite merry going about our business. And then someone says something, you're like, we just sort of hang out on our own clicks. We've just had enough. Like, I haven't spoken to a straight person in ages. Like, we just end up being so cliquey because it just becomes exhausting having conversations. And I feel as if there's significantly too much focus on the fact that, say for example, genitalia. That's not the point. It really isn't the point. The point is, can we get jobs? You know, can we get into clubs? Can we travel to Dubai? It's a quick big question mark. There's a lot of question marks around our identity, which I think kind of need to be addressed. So yeah,
like that's sums up everything for me. I feel that was perfect. And I think what's interesting following on from that would be to ask how we balance highlighting trans joy with highlighting trans pain and everything in between on that spectrum. And I'd love to hear from Evie on this to begin with.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because, like I say, a lot of times society, like I mentioned before, they just see the pain and they see the struggle and they don't really see the joy. But at the same time, media isn't interested in trans joy because that doesn't sell. That's not sexy. So, you know, they want to make TV that's about the trauma of being trans, or they want to write something or tokenize someone like myself, you know, to kind of get something out of me, to kind of highlight the hardships and everything like that. And when we are celebrating, when we are creating amazing content, when we are talking about our stories in a really positive way, a lot of people aren't interested in that because it's not kind of what the society is programmed to listen to. And I'm going to try not to swear. I'm going to try my best not to swear, but you know, that's some BS. And what I do in terms of like being a South Asian trans woman and being the Bolly Witch, the reason I created the Bolly Witch is because I was seeing nothing in terms of South Asian representation within the queer community, within the trans community, that is being properly recognized and celebrated, which is why all my performances, everything that I do, I don't do it in English. I inject myself into shows that may be predominantly white. And people say, Evie, why are you doing that? And it's like, because I have every right to be here as anybody else. And I've had that mentality throughout my entire transition. I transitioned 17 years ago. So when I went through my transition, it was very different. And I was, you know, from a Muslim community. So for me, it's about knowing when to speak up, and when you have the opportunity to speak up about your experiences, especially the joyous ones, and finding that balance. Don't be afraid to speak on your experiences, and don't be afraid of your abilities, whether it be dance, whether it be writing, whether it be performance. Any way that you are able to express yourself and express your story, do that. And people around you should be lifting you up as well. And when people aren't, speak on that and let people know, because that way we can kind of highlight exactly what the issues are of why are we not hearing more about trans joy, and why are we only hearing about the hardships? Well, we need to look at ourselves first. Are we lifting each other up, or are we not? Are we only going to celebrate Pride when a float goes by with some scantily clad cis gay white men all oiled up thrusting into the air to, I don't know, Katy Perry or some shit? Sorry, but it's like, are we just going to do that and think that that's the best representation, and think, oh no, we're not going to ask the trans people because they're just going to bring everyone down with their kumbayas and holding hands and talk about, no, actually we can talk about a lot of things and we can be really, really celebratory. But when we're having to like deal with so much of being repressed, it gets on us a lot. But then what we need to try and do is not take that energy on for ourselves, it's everybody else's. So remember to balance it out for yourself and put it out into the world.
I want to get the last part tattooed on myself. I think it's so potent and pertinent. And I would love to hear from Rico really quickly on how you interpret this question to how do we balance highlighting trans joy with highlighting trans pain and everything in between in that whole spectrum circle sphere?
I think I've been asked a few times to talk about trans joy in forums, and it's usually corporations asking that. And I always like to think that they want to sort of tick the diversity box, but they don't really want to have sort of negative stories while they advertise their merchandise. And I always feel as if it feels as if it's getting a little bit too close to tokenism as opposed to trans rights, because we're not equal. I look at hate crime statistics all the time, and it is quite triggering. And I'm sick of going to visuals. So the reality isn't what people want to believe. And I feel as if it's important to recognize that as a group, all of us are fighting incredibly hard on a daily basis. We are very, very proud of who we are. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that all of us make it. And that's just the truth of it, unfortunately. I think shows such as Pose are really good because it kind of has a little bit of the balance to it. I mean, you have the euphoria of the ballroom, but you also have the negativity. So that's kind of like a good way of getting around it. But I guess I'm always really, really hesitant when someone just asks for the one side of it, because there's two sides to every story. Fun fact, just to sort of bum everyone out, is that the average life expectancy of a black trans woman in the US is 35. So that paints a right picture for you. So there's work to be done. But on the average day, I had a gathering for my birthday of trans and non-binary people. The energy in my garden was just ridiculous. Like, everyone was just so warm and kind and friendly. And trans and non-binary people, we make family just really, really quickly because we kind of understand each other, and we're just a game changer, to be honest with you.
Thank you so much for such a vulnerable and powerful insight into that question. And I was wondering if anyone else wanted to share on this question in particular. Megan, go for it. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with all that's been said. I think as someone who's, been around quite a long time and started thinking about transitioning in the early 90s. I want to give a bit of positivity really about the way narratives around trans lives have changed and improved in the media. We talked about Pose, you've got Disclosure, Laverne Cox's documentary. There is a plethora of books by trans authors, a lot of young trans authors as well. There's a lot of magazine coverage, and we're seeing more and more trans people leading productive lives, through screen, print, and online. I think that trans joy is not accessible to everybody who's trans. I think it's very privileged. I'm middle class, white, gregarious, so I'm able to make connections and network easily. And I live in London, which is one of the most metropolitan cities in the world. And going back to what I think it was Rico said earlier about being in a bubble, I moved to London because the transphobia in the UK is abhorrent at the moment. And London offers me a bubble where I just surround myself with queer people. So I think about the trans people who are living in rural communities, trans people with disabilities, trans people of colour, etc., young trans people who aren't supported by their families. And I think that while it's important that we continue to highlight trans violence, those people need to see joy, and that it's accessible and that it's achievable and that you can make it out of where you are. So I think if you look back over the last 30 years, particularly in the UK, and I would say it's the same in the USA and Canada as well, if you go back 30 years, the narratives around trans people were very one-dimensional. It was trans women who are on the verge of suicide or grave mental health concerns, sitting in hospitals, having gender affirmation surgery, and it was very voyeuristic. And we've definitely moved on from that. People are more aware of the statistics around our healthcare. The waiting list in the UK for a first appointment is around 5 years, and this is in the media. It's not always framed in the conversations that we'd want. So, for example, the Times newspaper has published over 200 articles about trans people this year without even speaking to a single trans person. But the statistics and the negativity is still out there. So I just want to make sure that people watching this understand that if you go and look for trans joy, you will find it. Go on YouTube, go on pay TV, whether it's Netflix Prime or HBO if you're in the States or whatever, and go and find it and go and search it and spread that word.
I loved everything you just said, especially something that was striking to me was the first part about trans community and trans people really getting out there and getting involved in the media, in representation. And I feel like Joy really epitomizes many of those aspects. You're very prolific in academia in particular. And so I'd love to hear from you, Joy, on how you found trans joy in your experience. Has it been more of a personal or a communal journey?
Sure, that's a wonderful question. I think for me, it's always both. I think about how I started using they pronouns about 10 years ago. And I really, I had a very clear sense of who I was long before that, but it really was like knowing a friend who used those pronouns that made me feel like that was even a possibility. So these like very private personal moments are always connected with other people. And I know for me as a historian, and as a big nerd, I'm often reading books and reading documents and looking through old photo albums, getting all the gossip from 30 years ago. And that is a very solitary experience, while also being a very collective one. And I think that sometimes those collective moments can be challenging. We're a community that's very easily isolated. And I think it's one thing that we can do to help us collectively connect with all of the joys possible is just to remember that historically we've often found relationships in unconventional places. Like we have a history of letter writing and magazines. So however you are connecting with your community is a way that trans people have always connected with other trans people. And that those communities don't have to look like a sitcom. They don't have to be in person. Any way that we're connecting with each other and finding friendships and family is the right way to do it. That's been really important for me.
Absolutely. And Frankie, as someone with a magazine and someone who also studies at a large institution, a university, I would love to hear from you in the ways in which you find the trans community is fostering the positive in trans experiences.
Yeah, I mean, taking especially what Rico said about trans people making family everywhere, and I guess not to be kind of like the only Gen Zer here, but the internet is great for that. And I couldn't go to Trans Pride this year, but I remember spending that entire day just on my Instagram and just spending like every single second checking someone else's Instagram story to kind of listen and take part, even though I wasn't there. And there was so much joy felt from that, from being able to kind of still feel connected. Even though I am actually in a very rural area, I'm surrounded by just fields here and I dream of London. But it's still very possible to feel connected and have that family. In fact, transness is often the thing that I still feel connected to people by, because yeah, we search for it everywhere, constantly. I mean, I was, yeah, like trans officer at uni, and we had like coffees with the town, which is very rare in Cambridge. There's quite a big split between the university and the town. And it would be like all trans people from every age, people from the uni, people from the different uni. And it's so rare to see that. It's so rare to see the community come together in a place like Cambridge, and to see that basically through transness. People put that first, one, because there's so few of us, and also because it's so important. And those are some of the best times I had. And yeah, people create community in the weirdest of places. I found that trans people my age have a love of D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. I personally am not involved, but every trans person I know is on this and playing it all the time. And I just love that it's become like, you almost expect it. Every group chat has a reference to D&D, and they have chats everywhere. It's so like beautiful that, yeah, we search and find and put so much effort into it, because you have to, like, it's out of necessity ultimately. Because I mean, when there's no one around you understanding the experiences that you've gone through, I was the only trans person in my school for my entirety there, and kind of took on that advocate role, which I didn't really realize was not normal necessarily. It is, in fact, a lot of trans people to take the advocate role, but not kind of a common experience of childhood and teenagehood, and continued that. And that was my only understanding of transness, basically as an advocate for cis audiences. I didn't understand myself as a trans person outside of basically the cis gays. And getting to university and finding the opposite of that, and finding community and finding friends, and learning actually to see myself through their eyes, and see through their eyes like so much like beauty. Like, that was the best thing I ever could have asked for. And you can't get that for me often from kind of the cis communities I'm in. I have wonderful cis queer friends, but there is a difference. It feels different. It feels different to be like understood. And yeah, I think people are just, it amazes me every day where people find community where you wouldn't expect it, whether that's in the thralls of the internet or on the streets or various coffees. And I just think it's beautiful. It makes me hopeful consistently and always.
It's so wonderful to hear about how inspired you have been by community, and how you've managed to find that community in the strangest of places, the most obvious of places. I'd love to hear from Evie now. You encompass so many communities. Your performance is so multifaceted. You bring in so many different elements, from your South Asian background to Islam and in your family, and to just to your like accumulation of your performance identity. And so I'd love to hear about who or what inspires you to celebrate trans joy. Are these aspects of your identity and your background things that inspire you in that journey?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like when I was growing up in the 90s, you know, back when, you know, I remember the time when there was no internet, you know, because I'm that old now. I've become that person. But I grew up with, you know, watching Bollywood movies, and I would fall in love with like the Bollywood actresses, and I never understood why I was so drawn to them and everything like that. But then as I grew older and I realized you know, I was discovering like who I was in terms of like my queer identity, the more I uncovered, the more my own community was kind of saying to me, well, you can't be Indian and gay. you can't be trans and Muslim. You have to pick one. So as a result of that, I detached from my Indian heritage, so much so because I was so determined to kind of move forward and go down my trans journey. And then as I kind of got older and once I kind of got more comfortable with myself in of recent years and I started performing, that's what really inspires me. What really inspires me isn't necessarily a person, but my realization that I can connect with my heritage and I can connect with the color of my skin and, you know, where I come from and who I come from and still be unapologetically queer. Like I don't have to choose between the two, which is why I do what I do with my performances, because I want more people to realize that, because in Muslim communities and you know, it's still going on now where there's so many people who are afraid to be themselves because of tradition, because of family pressure, because of the kind of overwhelming feeling of not letting your family down, because it's been drummed into you that being Asian means you have to live your life a certain way. If you're a man, you have to live your life a certain way, and you have to follow the certain rules, otherwise you're completely disowned. It still goes on to this day, this whole kind of the disrespect that comes from being yourself. It's like it's still here, and I hate that. So if I can do what I can do to be as visible as possible, to be that representation for South Asian people, and say that, you know, you don't have to choose between the two. Is it a hard journey? Yes, it is, being South Asian and being queer, but you most definitely don't have to choose between the two. So that is actually what inspires me to kind of navigate my life in the way that I do today, rather than being quiet about who I am and thinking that I have to choose between the two.
Absolutely. Megan, what inspires you to celebrate trans joy?
What inspires me? Yeah, I think you know, people have captured the idea of community. I'm inspired by people's tenacity, by people's desire to survive and thrive, the way we change the rules, we bend the rules, we think outside the box, we live outside the box. We don't want to subscribe to what society says or what culture says in any particular time or space. I just think as I've grown in my trans identity, and I talked earlier about wanting to pass as cis in the early days, that's well out the window. I'm trans first, and then I'm a woman second. It's just the expansiveness that Frankie talked about that inspires me. And I meet people. I'm very lucky because I live in London, and I'm from Birmingham, another big city in the UK. I get to meet so many interesting people that actually challenge me. That's another thing that inspires me, that I have to challenge my understanding of what it's like to be trans. I'm a public servant as well. I work in the community. I absolutely love people. Everything I do is based in love. And to meet people that challenge my ideas of transness or sexuality, that's inspirational. So yeah, so it's a challenge, but it's a good one.
Rika, I'd love to hear your take on this question.
Because my ancestors were trans, to be honest with you. Like, the good thing about colonialism, there's like two sides of that. It explains to people why they have these learned behaviors. And if you're in the UK, Section 28 completely removed the LGBT community. So it means that all of your co-workers, employees, doctors, nurses haven't got foggiest idea about the LGBT community. So once you explain that to individuals, they'll say, oh, okay, well, the government's messed up, society's messed up, so here's some information. So so on a personal level, I like meditations, and one of my favorite one is my ancestors, and there's this app called Liberate, and one of them is done by a trans woman, black trans woman, And she says, your ancestors were queer, your ancestors were trans, your ancestors would have loved and accepted you. So even if you're having that pushback from your immediate family and your friends, that's just because they've been misinformed. They have a bias, which I'm not aware of. But your ancestors would have loved you. They would have been proud of you. So that sort of coming to that realization is just unbelievably refreshing. It just took a lot of weight off my shoulders. But on a day-to-day basis, I like the idea that if I could necessarily have changed the narrative for myself, I can change the narrative for other people. So I was talking to one of the top 4 consultancy companies in the UK, and I basically told them what it's like for trans people, give them some hate crime statistics, and they're just like, oh, this isn't good. I'm like, no, it's not. So if you're keeping an eye on hiring quotas for Black people or people of color, you need to do the same for the trans and non-binary community. What's your ratio in your company? I'm just like, oh, okay, fine. So now they're thinking about having a internship program for trans and non-binary people. So that sort of thing. And I said, okay, well, if you think about it, if we're not getting through university because of prejudice from our co-workers, from our colleagues, then you need to have a program in place for people who haven't got the same credentials as everyone else, because it becomes biased. So they're having those sort of conversations when people start to understand the individuals that they're trying to help and the best ways to help them. So, I mean, through Transactional, I've had the privilege of working with Department of Transport. I did a talk for them and explained to them what it's like for a trans person on public transport and how people are actively avoiding taking public transport on football days because they're just scared. You know, stuff like that. Politicians as well. I won't say the names, but a politician actually contacted me saying that we've got a speech coming up. What do I say in Parliament? It's like, here's some statistics. Please say these. So it's not always negative. Like a friend of mine runs Trans in the City, and they managed to help out Stonewall Housing and HSBC did a joint project together because people who are homeless can't actually get postcodes. So there's a specific bank account that HSBC is given to trans and non-binary people so they can get a bank account. So once organizations actually understand individuals, they can start working together. Things like that makes me happy. I mean, I'm aware of the statistics. They grind me as much as everyone else, but to kind of use negative stories that I are accustomed to and actually change the dialogue, that's what brings me joy. That's what I get out of bed in the morning to do. So.
And Joy, who or what inspires you to celebrate Trans Story? Another historian.
Oh, I love it. I feel like I'm in the business of trans heroes. So I have a long list of people who inspire me. Of course, like so many people, have been really moved by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. And for me, Sylvia and Marsha really made me proud to be trans in a way that I wasn't before knowing more about their stories and getting to hear from them in their own words, because I saw them as people who shared my own commitment to radical change and a vision for a better world that was much wider than just civil rights and legal recognition and TV shows about trans people. Along the similar lines, I have a lot of love and respect for Leslie Feinberg and the radical work that Leslie did throughout her life, and particularly. I've been particularly moved by Leslie's struggles for disability justice before her death, because that's something that's important to me as well as a disabled person. And it's this incredible thing to get to find people who I feel such kinship with. And to get to see people as whole people, because for me, that's the antidote to the way we're perceived and portrayed in the media as simultaneously extremely tragic figures and good consumers kind of superficially happy people, very beautiful people. Those are the people that we like to put on TV to represent the trans community. And when we're able to look back and see people who are complicated, who made mistakes, who had good things happen to them and bad things happen to them, who had like privilege and extremely difficult experiences. That's something that I find very healing, and that I'm excited to share with other people.
I think that leads on so well to my final question. I wish we could talk for so much longer, but unfortunately we are nearing the end. So my final question is, and I'd like to direct this to Frankie first, is what does a joyful trans future look like to you?
I find this question like so hard because I mean, for me, it's just so enveloped in so many things. Like you can't have a joyful trans future without it also being a future that's liberated for people of color and for the working class and for so many marginalized people. It's a whole scale systemic, uprising in essence. Because if we're going to take the gender binary, that's one of the fundamental structurings of our society, and to remove that is what a future kind of would look like for trans people, where we could be safe. Weirdly, I wrote down on my notes just no more gender reveals as a start. Like that would be lovely, just as a small win. But Ella nicely sent me some of the questions earlier, and I wrote a little bit about how cis allies. Oh, sorry, my phone is going off. It's all good. What cis allies can do to kind of, I guess, help with this future. Because if we're talking about joy, one of the things that I've come across, especially even with the most well-meaning of cis people, is this kind of idea of pity, which feels so prevalent and related, of course, to the narrativization of trans people as the kind of sufferers of society, that we are to be pitied. I remember my nana being a kind of old scale socialist telling me how she would love me regardless of who I brought back to meet her in terms of gender. And then in the same sentence saying, oh, but imagine being trans, like imagine living that life, how hard it would be, how absolutely just like horrific it would be to have to live that life every day. And yeah, of course, there's, as so many people have said here, like Rico especially, about the consistent difficulties, but it's not like a life to be pitied at all. And I think a future where trans people are joyful is one where we're considered joyful by everyone, where joy is kind of enmeshed into the kind of foundations of transness, where we're not considered someone to kind of look at and feel sorry for, but to someone to look at and like be like, wow, look how cool you are, that's amazing. Because that's how I feel from the trans community. That's how I feel we celebrate each other, is to consistently be in awe of everything that we do. And to go back to the question about who inspires you, like there's this idea of trans elders, to me, is something that just feels so prevalent. I mean, I guess like the AIDS crisis, and then to continue with Section 28, it felt like a whole generation was removed. And I feel often young enough to kind of experience this idea of trans elders, which is not necessarily related just to age, but also to kind of experience, I guess. And I just think of this future of, I don't know, almost like, imagine if a trans future was like Rico's garden party for his birthday, just every day, just community and sitting around and eating, and there being just a freedom there, and the little things, which comes from so much. There's so much that has to be done to get to that as a normality. But even the fact that we have those moments now, there is a potentiality for that. Like it feels like you can take from those small moments and feel from them the fight that you want to make that the everyday. And yeah, I mean, to start off, no more gender reveals, and to end, just like, get rid of it all. Let's change it all, please. And thank you. That would be a pretty hopeful future for me.
Mic drop. That was so well articulated. And I want to make sure I hear from you all. So Rico, please go for it.
What does it look like in the future? I would say that it's not really that big a deal, to be honest with you. I want to get to the stage where a child who comes out as trans isn't really worried about whether they're going to have a tough time at school with their parents, that they could just sort of, there won't even be a coming out, and just be like, just go to school one day and say, my pronouns are they, them. And I was like, okay, well, like that, it should be that simple. But as Frankie said, I probably won't tell people this, but if you do, gender is the fundamentals of our society, everything's gendered. You know, everything from toilets to applications, to literally everything's gendered. It doesn't really need to be. It doesn't make any difference, but not all political groups agree with that. So there will be a fair bit of debate in order to get to a position where we will be deemed equal. Because unfortunately, colonialism has done quite a fair bit of damage. But on the other side of that, the number of allies I've encountered, and positive and happy, bubbly people I've encountered, I don't think that is impossible. I think it's just simply a case of undoing the misinformation which is spread. As an example, like there's a trans columnist in the Metro. That's a relatively new thing. I didn't even know that. Metro to everyone else, like these sort of tabloid free newspaper that's sort of gets knocked around London for people from the US. So even tabloids are just like, oh, we want to be trans allies. So people are taking notice. But for me, I would think that, you know, if me not having any work as a diversity consultant, I would say that my job is done. I can just focus on my gardening, then I'll be happy.
How wonderful. It was revolution plus gardening. I think it's the ideal combination. Megan, would love to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think it's a complex question, and I think it's idealistic in a way. I don't think we'll ever have a perfectly trans joyful world. Discrimination's always going to exist, but for me, like, I want to see that all trans people are allowed space, not just those who fit into what society says is acceptable. I think about older trans people. Someone mentioned trans elders. I don't think I'm quite there yet, but I will be at some point. And I want to know that as an older person in society, that I get looked after, that I'm not misgendered in care homes and things like this. So I think that none of us are liberated until all the trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming people who don't pass are liberated, so there's a lot of access for particularly younger trans people to transition at an early age, to avoid a painful puberty. Cosmetic surgery is more available, but having been around for quite a while, there are lots of trans older people who don't have the luxury of passing in society, and until they don't get spat at and shouted at and assaulted, then there isn't any liberty for the rest of us. There's no liberation for the rest of us. So trans joy for me in the future is all about respect, accepting people as they are and their differences. There's lots of infighting in the queer community. We need to see an end to that. We need to see an end to a concept of who is trans enough. It's not a hierarchy with surgery at the top and changing your name at the bottom. You're trans enough, however you define your transness. So I think I could sit here and talk about a paradise, couldn't I, Ella, about we can all just get on and everything, but it's not realistic. But we start with respect, and that's what I want to see.
I personally would love to hear you talk about a paradise for queer people in the future. I wish we had time for that.
I want to set it up.
Exactly. So Evie, would love to hear from you. What does a joyful trans future look like to you?
For me, it starts with our own community and letting go of that gatekeepery mentality that our community is very well known for being like, when it comes to trans people of color, really. I have found that a lot of the barriers that I've come across has come from our own community, when it comes to opportunities and being seen and being accepted for who I am, being welcomed into the community. It's still really vile at times. Even here in Manchester, we have the gay village, which is like a safe space for queer people. It's quite well known here in the UK, and there's still transphobic incidents happening in the village by people within our community. One in particular I remember where a particular bar had a drag queen that was working there, and she was promoting one of her shows, and on the poster there was a picture of a unicorn that was puking up the black and brown stripe from the inclusive flag, and that was plastered all over the village. And it's stuff like that I am vocal and fighting all the time. It's like, how are we expecting the future of trans joy to kind of be across society if we're not even getting it right in our own community? We need to start there. We need to be solidified there, because our community wouldn't be where it is today without trans people and trans people of color. But it's very easily forgotten, because people want to kind of gatekeep and not make room at the top. They want to kind of keep that area and go very much kind of like within like South Asian families. It's kind of like, oh yeah, I don't mind the gays. But then as soon as there's one person who comes out as gay in their own family, you're disowned. So it's very people at the top kind of go, oh no, we accept trans people, but we're not going to make room for you. Like, just remember where you belong. And that's what I always say to people. It's like, that's what we need to work on. We need to work on, stop putting the white cis gay men at the top. And then when you want people to fight for our rights, you don't mind flipping that around. Let us fight and get everything back to normal. And then when things are back to normal, you flip it back again and we're back at the bottom. We need to stop that, because what it does, it just makes us it divides us, and then society see that and use that as a way of getting in and being a snake in the grass and making it even worse. So for me, the future of trans joy really depends on whether we can break that really toxic system that we as the community has kind of built up. And like Rico said, it's about unlearning really, really bad things and letting go of certain things, and not thinking that one person is better than the other. We're all equal. We're not trying to say that we're better than anyone else. We just want to be as equal as everyone else and just live our joy like everyone else is.
I really support that sentiment, and I love the theme of space and expansiveness that's been recurring throughout this discussion. It feels very important. So I'd like to end where we began, which is with joy. And no, that's cheesy, sorry guys. But sorry, this will have to be a bit quick, I'm afraid, but thank you so much.
Sure, well, thank you to all of you. I share all of these hopes for creating these futures. There are a couple specific things that I feel like need to be said coming from the United States. And one is that the epidemic of violence against Black transgender women in particular has to stop. We also here in the United States have a desperate need for healthcare, not just trans affirming healthcare, but healthcare period. And then we also need to not only acknowledge the Indigenous land that we're on, but give it back, and affirm the sovereignty of Indigenous nations. And I think all of those things are just essential for trans people to thrive. And then I want a world in which gender is something everyone chooses or refuses, and that we get to celebrate that, and that we are not afraid for that to change over time, and we're not afraid to talk about it and to market, which is really a way of saying, like, I want cis het people to get to have what we have, to know themselves in that deep way, and to get to feel as though they choose their gender and the way their bodies are moving through the world in the way that we have. I think we have a tremendous gift that we're offering the world. And I'm excited for the struggle to get to this world. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you so much. I just want to say the most massive thank you to you all for your honesty, your vulnerability, your insight. This has been so special, and we've talked about everything: joy, laughter, liberation, allyship, revolution. I'm now going to pass over to Yuki to continue our conversation in the Q&A section of this event. Thank you again so much.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and a extra big thank you to Ella for leading and facilitating that discussion. It was honestly so inspiring and just amazing to hear you all talk, and just, it was fantastic. Honestly, I have speechless. And so we are entering our question and answer period. And so we have about 15 minutes allocated for this time. So if you'd like to write a question in the chat, or you would like to raise your hand and ask it by unmuting yourself, that is totally fine as well. And also, if any panelists would like to ask any other panelists questions about the work that they're doing, or just, you know, what's your social media handle, whatever it is, don't be afraid. And yeah, I just want to say a big thank you again. And it looks like we already have some questions. And I'll just ask it: what can cis allies do to facilitate and platform trans joy?
I'll answer very briefly. For me, give your time and your attention and your money to places where trans people are clearly in control of how our stories are being told, because that control is where we're going to be able to give a look at ourselves in our fullness.
Would anyone else like to answer that question? Yes, Rico.
So some of my colleagues at Transactional pulled together a resource. So depending on how much time you have, this is Shay Brown, Megan. Shay's is amazing. So in the resource itself, there's resources that you can read, sort of keep up to speed with current politics, because for us, the front line of change is in political forums. So if you do contact your MP, that is just a sort of brilliant way of helping us out. And if you do prompt MPs to support trans rights, because unfortunately, the way the political situation is based in the UK, so this is very UK centric, is that politicians aren't aware of the mass support for trans rights. So therefore, when it comes to them making an objective decision, they sometimes don't necessarily side with the trans end of the debate. So political support is brilliant. Basic things like including pronouns in your work emails, encouraging your HR department to update their HR documentation on hate crime for trans people, escalation points, basic hiring practices, MX in all your forms for clients as well as internally, just some sort of awareness. Follow trans and non-binary people online, because they'll tell you precisely what's happening on the front line of change. It's just those sort of things, just sort of keeping track of it. And I think if you follow something which is probably more hate crime focused, it does kind of drain your emotional energy. I completely understand. So I follow people who are like part of the community, have like a bit of a balanced side. So it isn't always just a doom and gloom all the time. It kind of has a bit more balance to it. But yeah, that resource it gives you free access to some of the HR guides that you can send over. And there's also a list of MPs in the UK, and you can pretty much just copy the letter over and send it over to someone in the US. It's the same gig.
Thank you, Rico, for that resource. And Megan, would you also like to answer that question for us?
Yeah, I just want to keep it really simple. It's not difficult to be a good trans ally. I, like Rico, I'm a diversity and inclusion specialist in my day job. I work in the public sector. I do a lot of talks, I do a lot of conferences, I do a lot of policy work. The internet is your friend. There is so much out there, whether it's international groups, national, just local. We've talked about we talked about TV, film, documentaries, Instagram, and just go and follow people that don't look like you. I mean, I'm trans and I still want to be an ally. You know, I'm not a person of colour. I don't have a disability. So I go and look for people who don't look and sound like me. So it's not rocket science. Please, I don't want anyone to go away and make excuses that they couldn't find this sort of stuff. It's everywhere.
Thank you. I saw Evie, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I'll keep it simple. A very good friend of mine said to me once, you know, if someone ever asks you, like, what can an ally do to support trans people? And she just said, just have sex with one. That's what you should do. Just have sex with a trans person. Give them what they want. Okay. So for me, just going with that, for me, it's like, yeah, with that concept, it's like, yeah, with everything that we put out into the world with Megan, with what Megan said about, you know, following people and all that, it's like, yeah, we've got so much to provide. We've got so much to do. Get intimate with us. You know what I mean? Like, get intimate with our craft and what we do, and get involved and get intimate and get sweaty and slutty and all that good stuff. Like, metaphorically speaking, I mean, well, you know, maybe not all the time, but you know what I mean. But it's like, just like go for that, and just like, this is all that we're putting our joy out there, and we want to share that with you. We want to be intimate with you. We want to show you that there's nothing about us that's scary. There's nothing but joy and pleasure in who we are. And you should be privileged that we actually want to share it with you. So, like, you know, drop trow and let's get cracking. That's what I say.
I absolutely love that answer. Yes, I love that. And Frankie, I'll let you close out this question.
Thank you. I guess everything that everyone said, I think definitely comes first. But I do want to just say, like, in your spare time, like, sit with your gender for a bit. Give some time to how you relate to your own gender and how you embody it and how you relate it to other people. And as Joy said about wanting cishet people to kind of experience what we do, you can do that. Like, you can go and sit in your room and have a journal and have a sit and think about your own gender and find the joy in it itself. Make gender playful, have some fun with it. Because if gender was playful, if gender was conceived as this joyful thing, so many of the issues we have now wouldn't necessarily be issues, because currently it's seen as so fixed and you can't ever have fun with gender when it should be something that you can have fun with. So, you know, take 10 minutes out of your day and just have a think about it. Just sit with it yourself as a cis person and acknowledge that we all have gender. Gender is not something that trans people have alone. We all have it. So let yourself play with it, let yourself have fun, and just kind of give some time to it, because I think that's often not talked about. But also support trans people first. Do that, you know, in your spare time when you can.
For sure. Thank you so much. And we have another question from the audience. Are there any questions you wish people would ask you and the wider trans community more? I'm not sure who would like to go first, but feel free to unmute yourself.
I'll probably say something like, I think what I would love for, like, as in like a question that I would love to hear more is just tell me more about you. Like, let me tell you my story. Don't try and be intrusive and try and word a question to a trans person that is very entitled, and that's very intrusive to someone that, you know, you're trying to kind of say that because you're trans, I have every right to ask you a very intrusive question about what's between your legs. what your, what your dead name was, all that kind of thing. It's like, it's very entitled and it's very offensive when people kind of do that. And are you intrigued when you find out someone is trans? Yes, of course, I fully understand that. But let a trans person tell their own story. So ask people, like, tell me more about you, like, and let that flow out of the person, because they will only want to share stuff that feels comfortable for them. And if you open it to them and let them set the rules in terms of like what they choose to share, what they don't choose to share, then the narrative can be a lot more lot less triggering for someone, rather than being very entitled and asking a question that you would never ask a cis person. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, for sure. I love that answer. I love all of your answers always. And Megan, I'll have you answer this question and we'll move on to a question right after.
Yeah, I just want to quickly say simply, I want to hear someone say, can I give you a platform? We don't need people talking for us. I don't need well-meaning people talking for me, as kind as it is. We can talk for ourselves. And even as a trans person, I'll pass the mic as much as I can to people who aren't as privileged as me. And I don't do panels and interviews and stuff unless there's a representative from across the community. So it's just really simple. Can I give you a platform? And I guarantee you there'll be a trans person waiting to take it.
I love that, yes. And I'll let Rico answer this question super quickly.
Just really quickly. I want to get asked the questions that cis het people get asked all the time. I never really get those questions. Like, I want to talk about the person I'm dating. I want to talk about how I like dancing. I want to talk about what plants I'm going to put in my garden. I want to talk about that sort of stuff. It's just the boring stuff. Like, it's not the entirety of my identity being trans. So I want to talk about boring stuff, which I think is interesting, like Netflix, that sort of stuff.
Most definitely, that is, gardening seems to be favorites here. And just our last question here, from Elizabeth. As a pre-service high school English teacher, I'm interested in creating a classroom that is not cis heteronormative centered. What is one way that you think would help classrooms be affirming to students' gender and sexuality?
I love this question. It's very important to me, and and also thank you for being an English teacher and asking this question. I think that there are so many ways to do this, and I'm sure our folks who are diversity experts will have great answers about some of the basics, but I really wish that there was more of an emphasis on including queer and trans people in the curriculum. So when we're teaching English, let's teach the novels of queer and trans people. When we're teaching history, let's teach the history of queer and trans people. Let's really try to include queer and trans people not just as a diversity example or a kind of a learning experience, but in a curriculum, in the way that we belong. Like, when we talk about biology, let's talk about sex hormones in all of the complicated glory that they exist. I think that would go a long way to showing queer and trans people that we are actually important, not just there to be included, but that we are a part of the world that people need to know about in order to understand the entirety of human experience.
Definitely. Thank you for that answer. And I guess I'll ask Frankie this question as well, just because you're the most probably recently in kind of that high school and or school setting. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the big things that actually, I went to a faith school in a very conservative town in North Yorkshire, so that was a fun experience. And actually one of the best things that I got from my teachers was just teachers who made themselves actively known as an ally all the time, like consistently, you know, got involved in LGBT things even though they weren't, said, made their pronouns known if they wanted to, gave me a platform, checked in with me. And this wasn't just when I reached out to them, but they did it themselves in every classroom, regardless of like who was in it. I think the main thing was like assuming, not assuming that everyone in your classroom is cishet. Like there's going to be queer people in your classroom. There's probably going to be trans people in your classroom. Like making sure that you're making yourself publicly available as someone to go to. I mean, I survived high school because of about 3 teachers who did that all the time. And it was a lifesaver for me, definitely. I mean, it was so integral because they put it at the front of their work and they listened all the time. And I'm sure I'm going to go see some of them now. I mean, I didn't even do chemistry A level. I just knew about this guy because we were queer people. And he was a chemistry teacher and he spent his chemistry lessons teaching about gender and sexuality. I don't know how he managed to do that, but he did. And he just taught so many of these kind of, I mean, boys who do A-level chemistry, a lot of them were not clued up on this stuff. And he just spent all of his lessons doing this. And he was a safe space for so many people to go to because he was unequivocally, I don't know how to say that word, like an ally. And also, I mean, he wasn't an ally, he was queer, but making yourself publicly and like constantly available, I just think that was what I needed. And that was what made me okay.
Yes, Rico, I see your hand is up.
I think Megan was first though.
Oh, Megan, would you like to?
Oh yeah, thanks so much. I just think I was going to talk about the rules about clothing in schools. That's just so archaic. Let's let young people express themselves how they want to. And then secondly, about giving positive role models around femininity in schools. You know, to be feminine is to be seen as second class, and people who present as boys or assigned male at birth need to know that it's okay from a young age to be feminine. That's really simple for me. And then finally, I've done a lot of teaching over the years in schools about anti-homophobic and anti-transphobic bullying. I've been into many schools and taught to young people from 11 to 18. And the schools that have the most visible queer students are the one that make the conversations about sexuality and gender identity part of the curriculum, part of their assemblies, part of every lesson going. Like, it's just another thing. And we need to have those, we need to be able to have those open discussions. And it's okay if people challenge it. It's okay. I've had young people from religious backgrounds, from cultural backgrounds that have challenged my identity. And that's okay, as long as we're having the conversations. And there are a lot of schools that are afraid to open that door because of a backlash from parents. And we need to get over it and start having the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree with that sentiment. And Rico, I'll have you close off this question for us today.
Yeah, sorry, I say it very quickly because we're just at time. I would say that I would second what Megan said. It's important to discuss family structures because people tend to reduce gender identity purely to what happens in the bedroom. Realistically, the LGBT community is about who you love. So discussing family structures that aren't necessarily traditional do invite a certain level of acceptability of our acceptability of our community. Even at primary school, we're trying to include children's books that say, okay, so Frank has 2 dads, you know, there's different family structures. You don't have to talk about sex in order to be diverse and inclusive. But I think your age group, pre-service high school, I would say, so depending on what country you're in, there's going to be rules about what sort of literature you can introduce into schools. I know that the UK has reduce some of the restrictions, but I think the US might be slightly more restrictive about some of the stuff that you can teach in schools. But But the point being is that if you do have to teach the book, you don't necessarily have to agree with the book. So I would say it's quite beneficial to sort of write essays about, okay, do you necessarily think that, I don't know, Charlotte Bronte's book is inclusive? Do you think that the feminist movement would have appreciated that? Do you think that the gender stereotypes in this novel is appropriate? You know, you can kind of take old literature, which you have to teach, and kind of bring it into current time. Because I feel as if we all go through school and it's a bit of a production line. And we go in with such fresh ideas about the world, and then we all come out with exactly the same ideologies, which we all know now are wrong. So maybe it would be useful if you can kind of let people who are individualistic explore the ideas of being individualistic and encourage others to sort of catch up. That's what I want to say.
Thank you so much, Rico. And also a big thank you to all of our panelists who openly and honestly answered our questions for us today. And once again, just thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be here with us. And I'm going to pass it over to Isaiah, who's just going to do our quick giveaway announcement. And take it away, Isaiah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you all so much for sharing your stories. They're all so just incredible. I know that I've learned so much. So thank you for being so open and really sharing your experiences with us. And quick drum roll, please. So we'll be now announcing the winner of the draw. So quick drum roll. The winner of the giveaway is Bailey. So I'm not sure if they're still in the Zoom call right now, but we'll reach out to them shortly and get them their stuff. And once again, to everyone who attended, thank you so much for coming. This was an incredible event. And please follow Medical Herstory on Facebook, Instagram, as well as all of our amazing panelists. They're all doing incredible work, so definitely keep an eye on them. And as well, Rico's team, Transactional, has made an incredible resource as well, which I believe was posted in the chat, and we'll also post about it on our Facebook page as well. So with that, honestly, thank you all so much for coming here, and have a great day.